Hello, good morning, everybody. Once again, I'd like to first say God is good all the time. Once again, I repeat that God is good all the time. Now, this morning, I finally had a chance to review the George Floyd body-worn camera footage from police officers based off the death of George Floyd in their custody. At time frames, we must have a clear head and look for facts and also take time not to watch things based off of bias and prejudice, but looking for truth and justice. I would like to first start this off with the hard findings as I see it. And I really don't care how others feel about it. The reason is I look for truth. I don't look for emotion. I don't look for bias. I don't look for people giving out their own determination of fact unless it supports it. I would like to say directly that three of the four police officers should have their charges immediately dismissed, and those criminal charges should become a civil matter. And I'm going to explain why. Now, Derek Chauvin, however pronounce his name, that's a matter where those who performed the autopsy will have to decide on whether the death was intentional at that point or whether it was merely accidental or manslaughter. That's not my job at this time period or how I look at it. But I understand that leadership at the top levels needs to be able to explain matters like this, which has caused so much hate, division, and more all across this country that has continued to go on since the death of George Floyd and continues to go on to this day. I understand that some people may disagree, some may agree. It's my findings. Now, you could take it for whatever you want to take it for. But as far as I'm concerned, my findings I stick by, especially given what I have seen, what I have reviewed, and to give out clear judgment that hopefully people can understand on both sides. Whether they do, oh well. But I understand the seriousness of the matter. Now, when I watched the video, I can see officers approach George Floyd's car as it was stopped. At this point, on the suspicion that he used a counterfeit bill to try to purchase an item from a store. At that time period, guns was showing and pointed directly at George Floyd, which would cause most people to comply and also more concern over their own personal welfare. At that time period, George Floyd was given numerous instructions to keep his hands on the wheel, even at time frames to keep his hands on his head. At those time periods, George Floyd was clearly distraught and clearly discussing matters in which he had been through with police and also the loss of his mother, which we can all understand given the totality of the circumstance. There would be concern on his end as well as police officers trying to determine whether he is one telling the truth, but that also isn't in a police officer's arsenal. But also at the same time frame to make a clear judgment based off of what they faced at that time period. Did they have reason to detain Mr. Floyd? Yes, based off the fact that there was suspicion that a crime took place. Did they have reason to handcuff him? That is at the discretion of the police officer. You can be handcuffed and not considered under arrest, even though I don't agree with that analysis. But at that time period, it is an investigative stop, in my opinion. And at that time period is a different level of responsibility that comes with those type of investigative stops. Now, at that time period, they do place him in handcuffs, and there is resistance based off the fact that George Floyd admitted that he's claustrophobic and did not feel comfortable being in a police car given his viewpoint of the situation. However, police officers are not given that type of discretion. Their job is to make sure that they secure the scene regardless of what you say, unless it is based off of your medical condition. And at those time periods, they must assess what they need to do because they are not doctors. They are only given the basic training on trying to save a life, but does not mean that training will be enough to save a life. At that time period, we clearly see that George Floyd is still discussing his mother, his family, and his previous situations with police officers. At that time period, as they tried to put him into the police vehicle, we can all see he is clearly resisting at that time period. At that time period, once they got him into the vehicle, that's why we see the shaking of the car, which a lot of people had questioned why was there a commotion in the car after more video footage ended up surfacing after the fact. We now know the answer to that question. Due to the resistance, they pulled George Floyd out the car, which could confirm he is claustrophobic in closed spaces. But that is exactly the design of police vehicles to make sure that a person cannot escape once they are in custody. Now, being claustrophobic may be an issue in regards, but at that same time period, police officers are not aware of the fact of whether you're telling the truth or not. But they should not be the judge and jury or the executioner at that time period. But they must do their job based off the situation that is presented to make sure not only they are safe, but also the suspect is also not put in unreasonable harm to themselves as well as to others. At that time period, he is taken out the vehicle, still in handcuffs, as we all can acknowledge, and placed on the ground. At that time period, still struggling, also having raised the concerns of the fact that he can't breathe. We must agree that he has said that. But also at the same time frame, we at this time frame don't know whether he has drugs in his system or not. But at the time period, it's clear that he is still resisting and he is still giving out coherent statements that says he is still concerned about the fact he just lost his mother, another one where he can't breathe, and of course trying to give out a message at that time period to family and loved ones, which of course George Floyd would have been the best person to know his situation at that time period. But doesn't mean police officers know whether you're telling the truth or not. At that time period, medical assistance is supposed to be administered to try to save life or to try to make sure that you're not put in any further life-threatening circumstances. At that time frame, we see 3 to 4 officers hold down George Floyd at a time frame where he's still moving. At that time period, while in handcuffs, movement and jerking and more is still signs that police officers are trained to say that there is still some kind of resistance even with handcuffs on, even after the fact that they already attempted to put him into a secure vehicle. At that time period, yes, they would have used an increased level of restraint in order to make sure that the suspect not only is restrained and secure, but also at the same time frame that they are aware that there is no further threat or danger to themselves as well as to the suspect. We see two of the officers, one in the leg area, one in the back area. They are not using further excessive force. The question comes into play, though. Derek Chauvin's actions at that time period. We cannot excuse that, and I won't excuse it by far. Placing a knee on somebody's neck for that length of time without checking a pulse, or turning somebody over as they say that they can't breathe, is really negligence. Now, whether negligence is the intent for murder, that's not for anybody to decide unless it's in a court of law. But we can say that there is enough evidence in support to see that those charges are moved forward and he faced a jury of his peers. We also see another officer that's Asian. His last name is Tao. I don't know how to pronounce it. As he is talking to bystanders and trying to make sure the scene is secure. At that time period of the angle of the video that we see that initially starts off all of this that goes on across the country, where we see the most evil image that we can see from any side or any angle of what happened in those last moments of George Floyd's life. But what we can't see at the time period from that angle, that other officers are there and what they are doing at that time period in which George Floyd is on the ground. Nor can we see what resistance is going on until this body-worn camera footage was released. I do not see the other two officers, other than Derek Chauvin, doing anything excessive at that time period. Yes, should they have been more active in checking the pulse? Yes, should they have turned him over to make sure he had more of an airway? Yes. But does that mean it was criminal that they failed to do so given that time period? There was other mitigating factors to deal with. One of the officers thought that there was drugs involved and was clearly on with a dispatcher trying to ask questions on what to do based off of what he saw and perceived could be drug induced based off of George Floyd's actions. That is the training that police officers get at that time period. One of the other officers is not even using pressure at that point and is mostly only having a hand to make sure that his hand is on George Floyd's body. Of course, to help with stopping the resistance. But there's nothing further that you can see that he's doing to harm George Floyd or to hurt him. Now, mind you, police officers are not medical doctors. They are not EMS. They are trained with basic CPR. At that time period, we can all see Derek Chauvin still having his knee pressed on his neck. The reason why the head area is not really a threat to police officers unless there's more done, meaning the person is speaking from the tongue to say that they are going to continue to be a threat. We do not have that on that one because we can see George Floyd is talking to family members at this time period, and also at the same time frame making clear he still can't breathe. Most of that pressure of why he couldn't breathe wasn't from two of the other officers. Only one officer, Derek Chauvin, where the knee is clearly on the back of the neck. I do not see any unreasonable behavior out of two other officers that is helping to restrain. But I do see a possibility of unreasonableness with putting a knee to George Floyd's neck for that long without checking a pulse, or to check on the fact after he becomes unresponsive to do immediate CPR at that time period. But at that time period, the law is faint when it comes down to when CPR should be administered. But was the delay so far off to the point that a reasonable officer should have known? That's where it becomes that gray area. That gray area supports the conclusion in all ways that 3 of these police officers should not be currently charged or facing trial. Because even with the 3rd officer that is paying attention to a crowd, must make sure the scene is secure, is only looking back, and it is reasonable to believe that 3 officers that are closest to George Floyd is making the best determination based off the facts there at that time period, and they did not make that officer aware that was holding back the crowd of the condition of George Floyd. Which even if a crowd is yelling certain things, officers are still designed to make sure that the crowd stays back and that there is no further threat to any police officer or the suspect in general. As much as you may not like the fact of what Mr. Officer Tao was doing, he was still doing his job. And it is a difference between Officer Tao seeing just Derek Chauvin having his knee on the neck than knowing that there is 3 police officers securing that area and also having custody of George Floyd that is closest to George Floyd to make that determination. So what I'm saying is, directly off the break, if there was also drugs in George Floyd's system, which an autopsy from both ends has said drugs was in his system, fentanyl and methamphetamines. Hopefully I pronounced it right. But fentanyl is a very dangerous drug. It's one of the drugs that across Virginia is problematic, especially for opiate addicts. When taking a drug like that, you put your life at risk. Certain factors of not being able to breathe and hallucinate and more is consistent with those drugs. Especially having them combined, yes, can lead to a fatal overdose. But I cannot make that determination because I'm not a medical examiner. But this is going to be a situation where Derek Chauvin and the medical examiners in a trial will have to occur to determine whether there was criminal conduct or was this accidental. That's for a trial. But when the justice system, prosecutors and judges cannot rule on a case based off the fact of public outcry or refuses to make a decision in the interest of justice, but instead waits for the timing of when justice is rendered, it serves not the public. It doesn't serve justice. Justice must be justice once known. So I stand in support of 3 of the officers having their charges dismissed. But I do not excuse the fact about whether there was a failure to intervene or a failure to provide reasonable medical treatment and other factors. But those factors are civil in nature, normally left up to a state and federal court for those lawyers to work out, and those defendants as well as the plaintiffs that have handled in the court of law. But I do not see criminal conduct out of 3 of the 4 officers. But I can't say I see criminal conduct on Derek Chauvin either, because I'm not the jury, I'm not the judge, I do not decide that outcome. But I do see that there is enough to move the case forward to find out, based off of further fact-finding, whether Derek Chauvin is guilty of the charges that are presented before him. Had this video been released sooner than later, and based off the body-worn camera, this is why body-worn cameras need to be released upon request. America burned itself down, riots and looting and more. And had this video been released, the public could have made a clear, conscious decision based off of the facts of the matter, not people assuming, and not based off of witness statements that we clearly now know wasn't all true. And this happens a lot with police investigations. This does, where witnesses give out account because they are under pressure to say a certain narrative instead of saying the truth. I understand why people in Minnesota and those across this country is pissed off. I do. And that image from that cell phone shows the reason why we must see all angles and all footage that comes with these type of cases, where the public can be either misled or it could clear up matters that are left, that are valid questions for all that are involved or all those that are seeking answers to what happened. Not every single time we see a situation the cop is wrong. Not every time do we see a situation where the suspect is right. What I do see is both sides contributing to each other's peril. But also at the same time period, was it enough to say that the intentions was to kill George Floyd? I can say 3 out of the 4 officers, there's no way we can conclude it based off the body-worn camera that they had any intent to kill George Floyd. Actually, it was opposite. One doing their job and 2 others doing their job and using reasonable care. But there was a clear lapse of judgment about how this matter was handled. Not because of how they detained Mr. Floyd, except for the neck and the knee issue, but whether they provided medical care in a reasonable manner. And I'm sorry to tell people, and it's hard to say for a lot, and it's hard for those to understand. I can say that part. But it wasn't criminal. No, it wasn't criminal. Now, a clear lapse of judgment, negligence, that's questions for a civil trial, if it even makes it to it. But I will encourage the city of Minnesota not to put the family through a civil trial. But I do believe one officer, Derek Chauvin, must face trial. No doubt about it. But the right call, if they can't do it, then you need to send in a special prosecutor and assign a new judge that can make the decision that is not ruled by mob or influenced by the riots or looting. No person should sit in jail or sit subject to an offense if there is clear evidence that no crime took place by those particular individuals. So I will stand in support of 3 out of the 4 police officers involved in this matter and say that their charges should be dismissed. But I will not go as far to say Derek Chauvin's charges should be dismissed. But I'm not going to go as far to say that I feel he's guilty and that should be the verdict. It's too much information and too many facts that have not been disclosed that needs to be handled by a trial and jury. And I hope everyone across America accepts the verdict, no matter whether you agree with it or not. This is where justice must be served, and it may be counter to some of these groups' interests or individuals or the family and more. But I cannot continue to support a cause unless I'm supporting it on truth and based off the totality of the circumstances. That's exactly what I'm saying. So to America and to, of course, Minnesota and, of course, the Virginia citizens and all those across this country, those who are rioting and looting and doing what they are doing is not doing it for George Floyd's cause. That's clear. So, as police officers and those who lead and those city leaders, it's time to take back America, because this is not the case. This is not the circumstances in which we justify giving out concessions or doing business for America by being ruled by mob, because this is about a mob that has ran wild and it needs to be crushed and stopped where it's at. And that's my final results on this whole matter. So whether people like it or not, you know how I feel about it. You know exactly where I stand. And I double down exactly where I stand. Because it ain't about how I feel. It's about the truth of the matter. And I hope leaders from across this country, of different groups that have been involved, I hope that you have the courage to stand up to your own members or your supporters and say the truth of the matter, because it's what you don't say or leave out that doesn't make you a leader. Being a leader sometimes comes with telling the truth, whether people like it or not. Not because we want somebody guilty, because we want them guilty, because it serves our own personal interests. Personal interest is not justice. And once again, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to watch this Facebook Live. I hope that you take the time to watch the videos you have. I know it's hard to actually watch somebody pass away before your own eyes, but you have to understand, if you was able to make a determination based off another video, you need to owe it to yourself to make sure you make time to see the truth in others. So everybody have a blessed day, and this is how I feel about the consequences and the conclusion of George Floyd's death. Have a wonderful day.